Kia ora koutou. My name is Marguerite Hill. Thank you very much for coming today and having me in your living room or lounge or office. I hope that you can all hear and see me. I hope that you can all see the slides because there's quite a lot of images that I hope you'll be able to see and follow as we go through. So today we're going to look at 4 heritage buildings on Symonds Street that have a connection to Auckland's medical history. The 4 places are all scheduled historic heritage places under the Auckland Unitary Plan, and most of them are on the Heritage New Zealand Pohuri Taonga list as well. I'm the heritage researcher for Auckland Council's Heritage Unit, and I've researched these places as part of my work in improving the information we hold about scheduled historic heritage places in Auckland. Symonds Street, as Liam said, was once known as Auckland's Harley Street, the New Zealand equivalent of London's exclusive street of medical practitioners. Harley Street has been synonymous with high-end private medical practitioners since the middle of the 19th century. This is because of its location, close to wealthy patients living in affluent areas like Regent's Park, and later the hospitals and medical institutions that developed nearby. This photograph shows Harley Street in 2011. And this isn't the good end of Harley Street. There was quite a lot of status associated with what number Harley Street a practitioner has. And the closer to the park, the better. And unfortunately, this is actually the other end of Harley Street. But I'm sure it's still very fancy and expensive. New Zealand has its own equivalents of Harley Street, albeit on a much smaller scale. In Wellington, this was Willis Street, and in Auckland, it was Symonds Street. Symonds Street had similar advantages to Harley Street, its proximity to Auckland Hospital and Queen Street, as well as its location in a green and affluent suburb. As a result, medical practitioners set up in Symonds Street and nearby Princes Street. In 1928, there were 14 registered medical practitioners giving their main address as Symonds Street. These included names like Keith Mackey, an orthopaedic specialist, George Douglas Robb, a pioneer of cardiothoracic surgery, and Alice Woodward Horsley, who was the 3rd woman to obtain a medical degree in New Zealand. By 1954, the number of registered practitioners had increased to 37. Many gave their main address as Auckland Hospital, but likely had rooms on Symonds Street as well. The development of the University of Auckland after the Second World War changed the character of the area, with many residences and boarding houses purchased by the university for its use. In 1957, Dr. Douglas Robb that I mentioned earlier wrote a 59-page booklet arguing that the university should not develop its Princes Street site and should instead move to Hobson Bay. In the same year, 88 doctors signed a petition angry that the expansion of the university was dispossessing 53 doctors of their consulting rooms. And you can see in this article, they actually describe it as Auckland's Harley Street. As we know, the university did expand around Symonds and Princes Streets, and it continues to grow, largely upwards now. The shift to the medical clinic model in the 1970s also impacted on small private practices. Nowadays, medical specialists tend to share clinics, with many now found in Newmarket, Remuera and Epsom, clustered around the private hospitals of Auckland. During the 19th and early to mid-20th century, it was very common for doctors to have their consulting rooms in their private residences. Many specialists split their time between hospital work and their private patients. 3 of these 4 places were built to be a doctor's residence and consulting rooms. So these places were homes as well as workplaces, something that we're growing all too familiar with in lockdowns. I was curious about how the doctors and their families kept their private lives separate from the patients who were entering what was both a domestic and a business space. Today we'll look at some original floor plans to see how those public and private spheres were separated through functional zoning. It is interesting to note that all of these places look very domestic. From the outside, they appear to just be residences, with little clue that a business was operating inside. Often the only hint is an extra entrance or 2, which allowed patients, family members and staff to access the appropriate parts of the house. Research in Canada suggests that this domestic appearance was about the comfort of patients as much as the convenience of doctors. It was part of a larger shift from doctors making house calls to patients coming to the doctor's consulting rooms at an appointed time. It is thought that a comfortable waiting room in a normal-looking house helps patients cope with this transition, and it supported the feeling that a doctor, especially a general practitioner, was an approachable medical figure. The domestic environment may well have been soothing for worried patients, not sure of what their appointment would hold. These houses also tell us about status. 3 of the 4 places we will look at today were designed by leading architects in architectural styles that were fashionable at the time. The properties are statements of the doctor's good taste, status, and role in the community. And lastly, we will look at the people who lived there, as they all were rather interesting. So, the first property we will look at is a 2-for-1. 84 to 86 Symonds Street was originally 2 entirely separate doctors' houses and consulting rooms. They were built several years apart, but they were designed by the same architect, Malcolm Graffin, to be in sympathy with each other. The 2 properties were joined together in 1975, and because of their design and materials, many people would probably not notice that they were once separate buildings. 84 Symonds Street was built in 1935 to 36 for Dr. Eiley Elaine Gurr, known as Elaine. Dr. Gurr was closely involved with maternal and infant health and trained in obstetrics overseas, including at the renowned Rotunda Maternity Hospital in Dublin. On her return to New Zealand, she was hired by the Department of Health to set up antenatal clinics at St Helens Maternity Hospitals. She also oversaw the training of Plunkett and St Helens Hospital nurses. She set up a general practice in Symonds Street in 1932, specialising in obstetrics and gynecology, and continued to practice there for 30 years. In 1983, she became the first woman to be made an honorary fellow of the Royal New Zealand College of General Practitioners. From newspaper articles, it seems like Gurr was a prolific public speaker, advising on everything from emergency first aid to the mental health of adolescents. She was actively involved in St John's and Plunkett. Dr. Gurr's father lived with her until his death in 1948, and evidently she was a keen gardener. Gurr was a major benefactor to the Auckland and medical communities. She endowed chairs of medicine at Auckland and Otago University medical schools, paid the salary of a vet for the Auckland SPCA, and supported St John Ambulance and the Salvation Army. She retired to Torbay and died there a month or so after her 100th birthday in 1996. Her biography in the Dictionary of New Zealand Biography states that her patients were her family to the end. Gurr commissioned Malcolm Graffin to design her a purpose-built residence and consulting rooms in 1935. Here we have the front elevation from Graffin's plan. Patients accessed the house via a doorway on the left and the double doors on the right after the garage. Looking at the floor plan of her house, we can see how she balanced the domestic and business aspects of her life. So I hope you can see this. It's a bit smudgy, as it is a copy of a copy. But on the left, we have a ground floor plan for Elaine's house, and on the right, we have the rooms that the patients would have accessed. So she had a waiting, consulting, examining, and dressing room on the ground floor of her residence, as well as a bathroom. These spaces were at the front of the ground floor, accessed via an entrance lobby. There was also a dining room, kitchen, and bedroom at the back of the house, also on the ground floor. These domestic rooms were separated by a separate hall, which could be closed off from the front of the house. In between the 2 areas was a laundry, something that would have been used for both medical and domestic purposes. Upstairs, there were 2 more bedrooms, a sunroom, a lounge, and a large bathroom. These were all generous spaces. The lounge was almost 23 feet, that's 7 meters long. Traditionally, the lounge would be found downstairs in a traditional New Zealand house, but here it has been displaced by the waiting and consulting rooms. Elaine had a separate garage for her car. The garage is still there. You can just see it underneath all the ivy with the sign for the spa in front of it. So we can see that Gurr and Graffin zoned the house so that her private quarters were to the back of the ground floor and upstairs, and the public rooms were to the front on the ground floor, preserving her privacy and domestic space. Moving next door, we will take a look at the house and consulting rooms at 86 Symonds Street. They were built for Dr. Alexander Henderson Kirker, a physician who trained in London before returning to New Zealand to set up a practice in 1928. His first practice was on Symonds Street as well, at number 93, with David Norman Watson Murray. Kirker also worked at Green Lane Hospital from the 1930s to the 1950s. After his retirement, he became an honorary consulting physician there. He was a foundation fellow of the Royal Australasian College of Physicians, which was incorporated in 1938. Dr. Kirker commissioned Malcolm Draffin to design his new home in 1937. It was designed to accommodate Dr. Kirker, his two sisters, and his consulting rooms. As you can see, it is on a much grander scale than Elaine Gurr's property and sits much closer to the street. And this photograph actually shows you quite well the Symonds Street side and then the side that almost has a little courtyard, which you'll see the Symonds Street side was where the consulting rooms were and the family parts of the house were on the courtyard and back of the house. Kirker served with the Royal New Zealand Medical Corps during the Second World War, rising to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. During the war, he met and married Joan Johnson, who was in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. And on the left, we have Dr. Kirker in his uniform. And on the right, he is pictured giving the New Zealand wrestler Lofty Blomfeld a physical. Alex and Joan had 3 children, Jim, Anne, and Barbara. In 1950 and 1955, they altered the house to accommodate their family, including adding 2 bedrooms for their daughters, Anne and Barbara. The Kirkers remained at 86 Symonds Street for 30 years. I've been fortunate to have had an email conversation with Jim Kirker, Dr. Kirker's son, who has told me about growing up in the house. He remembers the fun of playing hide and seek in such a large house, which had lots of nooks and crannies to hide in. He and his sisters had a sandpit and swings on the roof. He also recalls many of the families who lived around Symonds Street and the other doctors' children that they used to play with. They used to head through a hole in the fence to Grafton Gully to play. The floor plans we have are from 1937 and show the original iteration of the house when it was occupied by just Dr. Kirker and his sisters. The floor plan, again, we've got the whole ground floor on the left, and then the inset is the consulting rooms. So it shows us that there was a consulting room, waiting room, and nurse's room on the ground floor on the street side of the building. Patients arrived at the front of the building and walked up some stairs to access a front porch and an entrance hall. To your left was the waiting room and the nurse's room, and to your right was the doctor's consulting room, a bathroom, and a utility room. There were multiple entrances to the house on the ground floor. If you were a family visitor, you could continue up the loggia, past the patient's entrance, and enter the house via continue up the stairs, past the patient's entrance, and into the house via the terrace and loggia, which brought you to another hall and a lobby. From there, you could get to the dining room or Dr. Kirker's study, which was quite separate to his consulting room. Or like Dr. Gurr's house, you could continue upstairs to the lounge. According to Jim Kirker, the study was used as a sitting room for the family rather than as a study. So we should remember that residents don't always use their houses the way their architects expect them to. Also on the ground floor was a dining room, kitchen, and 2 maids' bedrooms. Here you could access the kitchen or staff entrance and head out to the back garden. From the kitchen, you could access the basement, which was excavated under the house. In the basement was a garage and a billiard room, along with the maid's bathroom, laundry, and a dark room. The dark room was a mystery to me until Jim Kirker told me that his aunt, Marion Queenie Kirker, was a successful photographer. Queenie travelled to London to learn specialised photographic techniques. The work can be found in the photography collection of Te Papa. And I asked Jim about the billiard room and billiard table. It was not in use by the time Jim was around. Instead, their mum, Joan, converted it to a ping pong table. Back upstairs, on the first floor, was the lounge, which took up the whole width of the street side of the house, coming to almost 32 feet, which is 10 metres across. There were also 3 bedrooms and a bathroom. The architect for both of the houses was Malcolm Draffin. He also designed some alterations and additions to the Kirkus property during the 1950s. Malcolm Keith Draffin was part of the architectural firm Grierson, Amer and Draffin, which is best known for designing the Auckland War Memorial Museum. They also designed the Parnell Library, the South British Insurance Building, and other significant buildings around Auckland. Draffin began his architectural apprenticeship in 1906 with J.W. Walker, and in 1910 he joined architect Edward Bartley. He became a full partner in 1914. He served overseas during the First World War, and after the war he travelled and trained in Europe. Upon returning to New Zealand, he became a sole partner in the firm of Edward Bartley and Son and M.K. Draffin. In 1922, he joined with Grierson and Amer when they jointly won the competition to design the Auckland War Memorial Museum. They received the New Zealand Institute of Architects Gold Medal for this project. Draffin was a highly successful architect when he was employed by Gurr and then Kirker during the 1930s. Their choice of architect would have emphasised their status as successful doctors working in an exclusive street. Both properties are neo-Georgian in style. Like the choice of architect, this style speaks to success and authority. In her report for Heritage New Zealand, Elizabeth Cox notes that neo-Georgian architecture was synonymous with upper middle class concepts of good taste during the interwar period. The Gurr house is traditionally neo-Georgian. It is symmetrical and uncluttered in its design, while the Kirker building is more expansive. Both properties originally had flat roofs, so the mansard roof that was added to number 84 in 1979, I think, and had small paned windows, so they would have been even more similar originally than they appear today. In 1959, Dr. Kirker had the ground floor of 86 Symonds Street altered. The dining room and study were converted to a consulting room and a waiting room for another practitioner. The first to take up the lease was Bernard Sheaf, a gynecologist. Next was Noel Roydhouse, an ear, nose and throat surgeon. It was then used by the Auckland Disabled Persons Placement Board in the late 1960s. The property continued to be used by medical practitioners until the 1970s. In 1972, it was being used by a Dr. Sullivan. The titles for the two lots were combined in 1975, by which time the property had become a law office. That year, the two properties were joined together by a brick addition for the law firm Martelli, McKeag and Wells. And you can see that as office number 7 and gallery on this plan. So they added quite a nice window feature from the outside as well. Dr. Gurr's house is the one on the left and Dr. Kirker's is on the right. The properties were partitioned into numerous offices and meeting spaces, as you can see, but the basement billiard room was retained as part of the staff area. Since then, the building has had many tenants, including Metro Magazine. Nowadays, the tenants include a day spa, acoustics engineers, and a cafe called the Brick House. If you ever pop in for a coffee, you'll be sitting in what was once Dr. Kirker's garage, with his consulting rooms directly overhead. So that's the room with the big window and the shutters with the street number beside it. So moving on to our third property. You're probably all familiar with this place because of its current iteration as Rationalist House, but it was originally built as the family home and consulting rooms of distinguished surgeon and military man, Dr. James Hardy-Neal. Dr. Hardy-Neal was a preeminent ear, nose and throat surgeon working at Auckland Hospital from 1903 until 1948, and he was a consulting oral surgeon up until his death in 1955. He was born in Dunedin in 1875 and studied medicine at the University of Otago. He served overseas as a surgeon captain during the South African War and was a lieutenant colonel in the New Zealand Medical Corps during the First World War. He received the Distinguished Service Order and the Belgian Croix de Guerre for conspicuous gallantry and devotion to duty in 1918. Here he's third from the left, just about to light his cigarette. He didn't serve overseas during the Second World War, but he would have been busy nonetheless. He was the Deputy Director of the Auckland Medical Boards, which was responsible for medically signing off new recruits. And he was also involved with the Emergency Precaution Scheme. And he also provided pastoral care for servicemen and their wives. He was involved in a number of national and international medical organisations and was president of several, including the Pan-Pacific Surgical Association. He lent support to a variety of charities and organisations involved with improving the welfare of the hearing impaired, acting as the president of the New Zealand League of the Hard of Hearing, which is now the Hearing Association, and the Auckland Society for Deaf Children. He published articles in the British Medical Journal, as well as books about nursing patients with ear, nose and throat conditions. And he also wrote a pamphlet about field ambulance organisation, which is what he was responsible for during the Civil War. He designed an early bronchioscope, equipment which allowed a doctor to view a patient's airway. He was awarded a Commander of the Order of the British Empire, a CBE, in 1947. James married Mary Elizabeth Coates in 1903, and they had 7 children: Mary, Lydia, Annie, Thomas, Minnie, James, and Olive. Thomas also became a doctor, registering in 1936, and father and son wrote a pamphlet together. In 1912, Hardy Neal commissioned architects Wade and Wayne to design his residence and consulting rooms. In June of that year, Wade and Wade accepted a tender for the construction of Dr. Hardy Neal's house. The accepted tender was valued at £3,300. In December of that year, a newspaper article announced that the 2-storey residence in brick and stucco was almost complete. The house had 14 rooms and all modern appointments, including electric lighting throughout. The Hardy Neal family called their home Pahi. So what can the floor plans tell us about how the family used the house? They show us a waiting room and consulting room on the ground floor, and the family areas of the house clearly separated and defined. Now, I have flipped the plans this time, so I hope it's not too discombobulating, just so that they fit a bit better on the page. And again, we've got the full ground floor plan on the left, and then an inset of the business rooms on the right. So unlike Dr. Gurr and Dr. Kirker, who had their consulting rooms to the front of their houses, this time the doctor's rooms were along one side of the building. The house had a waiting room and consulting room on the ground floor, which was accessed via the front porch. There was a small lobby which led directly into the waiting room. And if you look at the way the doors are angled, visitors were basically forced into one area or another quite cleverly. So we went straight into the waiting room, so from the front door, and then gained access to the consulting room when it was your turn. But if you follow the corridor, you would find the more private rooms of the house: the drawing room, den, kitchen, and dining room. The use of the word den is interesting here, and I'm curious to know how the room would have been used by the family. The drawing room remained downstairs here. It wasn't shifted upstairs like Griffin had done to the 2 properties up the road. The first floor had 3 large bedrooms and 4 smaller ones, as well as a large bathroom. And remember, the Hardy Neals had 7 children. The basement boasted a bedroom, another one, and a laundry. And each floor of the house had a balcony. You can see those in these sections. On the first floor, there was also a glass room or conservatory. The 1912 plans were drawn up by Henry Logan Wade, known as Harry. Here he is about 10 years before the Hardy Neal Commission. Harry's father, Henry Greenwood Wade, founded the firm, and Harry and his brother Thomas ran the firm as Wade and Wade from 1899. Harry was born in Auckland in 1878 and was trained by his father. He was the secretary of the Auckland Institute of Architects from 1900. They also designed the Mount Eden Borough Chambers, 1YA radio station building with Alba Bartley, and the former Turkish Baths, now apartments, on Lawn Street. The firm was clearly proud of this building, using it in an advertorial that appeared in the New Zealand Building Progress magazine in 1914 as a key example of the company's work. This building is an example of Edwardian eclectic, with intricate decoration to the chimneys and 4 iconic columns with volutes on the front elevation. There is a half-circular porch on street level and a matching balcony upstairs. The window glazing and the exposed eaved rafters are also decorative. There are 5 chimneys, and the moulded chimney pots mimic the gables of the house. So they've got little pointy decorative elements to them. But so the building is probably better known to you all as Rationalist House. The Auckland Rationalist Association was initially founded in 1923, but only survived for 1 year. It reformed in 1927, and by 1929, hundreds and sometimes thousands of people would attend its weekly meetings and film screenings. Famous members of the association included future Prime Minister Michael Joseph Savage. In 1960, Hardy Neal's property was purchased by the Auckland branch of the New Zealand Rationalist Association Incorporated, and over the next few years, they hired group architects to undertake the conversion from a residential to an office building. The home and consulting room were converted into offices, committee rooms, and a library and lounge. Ivan Juris and Bill Wilson's names appear on the drawings. The group are known to have undertaken commercial fit-outs, including the Freeman's Hotel in Drake Street during the 1960s and 1970s. They are best known for their residential designs and their role in developing a vernacular New Zealand architectural style. Further alterations were undertaken in 1961, again by the group. As well as the Rationalist Association, there have been a number of tenants over the years, including the Hole in the Wall Trick Musicians Club in 1969, and since at least 1976, there has been a cafe. The current one is called Ration. Our final property has a long association with medical practitioners, as well as a trailblazing woman politician. This property was built for John and Eileen Endine in 1897. Unlike the other properties, it was rarely lived in by the family and was instead let to tenants. Ellen Endine also owned the lot next door at 2, 4 and 6 St. Paul Street. Members of the Endine family retained the property from 1897 until 2008, which is quite remarkable. Here we have the Endine's buildings in about 1899 to 1902, so not long after they were constructed. The procession you can see is for Lord and Lady Ranfurly. Ranfurly was the governor of New Zealand at the time. This place is different to the other 3 properties that we've looked at, in that it was not commissioned by a doctor to be his or her residence and consulting rooms. Instead, it is a series of terraced houses, which is a very unusual building form for Auckland and indeed New Zealand. The Dilworth Terraces are a notable exception in Auckland, and there are some examples in Dunedin. If the Endines built the property to be a rental, then they were canny, as each of the terrace houses has its own address and entrance. This is probably one of the reasons why it has been so popular with medical practitioners throughout the 20th century. There were other non-medical tenants as well, with Lush and Sons civil engineers operating there for at least 5 years. And number 29 was advertised as a boarding house called Abbotsford throughout the 1920s and 30s. When I posted the photo before to social media, it elicited memories from our followers of visits to medical practitioners and allied medical professionals. During the mid-20th century, dentists and diagnostic labs were based there. Another specialist who had rooms there was Dr. Selwyn Morris, an orthopaedic surgeon, and one of those very Auckland examples of 2 degrees of separation. He was Dr. Alice Woodward Horsley's son-in-law. As well as being an unusual building form for Auckland, the building also has a distinctive gable form called a Dutch gable. The bricks for the property came from Arch Hill Brickworks in Grey Lynn, and they are used as a decorative feature. The architectural style is neo-Jacobean. Heritage New Zealand describes the property as one of the most architecturally distinctive terraced houses in New Zealand and a very rare example of neo-Jacobean architecture of the late Victorian period. Unfortunately, the architect and builder are not known, and we do not have plans for this property. So instead, I'll talk a little bit about the Endine family and some of the doctors who lived there. John Endine was born in Cornwall in 1844 and emigrated to Australia in 1863, where he became a gold miner. He later sought his fortune mining in California and Nevada. He eventually arrived in New Zealand in 1870, mining for gold in Thames. There he met his wife, Ellen Phillips, daughter of Harry Phillips, an early Thames settler. They married in 1871 and took up hotel keeping in Grahamstown, near Thames. They moved to Auckland in 1877, taking over the Railway Terminus Hotel and then the Waitemata Hotel, which was in a prime location at the corner of Queen and Customs Streets. John maintained his interest in mining, owning numerous other claims during his lifetime. In 1905, John commissioned Edward Marnie and Sons to design a building on leased land at the corner of Queen and Key Streets. This building caught fire and was replaced in 1975, and this is the replacement, which was designed by Chilwell and Trevelyan, and it still stands today. So that brings us to Ellen Endine, who was the first woman to run for Auckland City Council. Ellen stood as a city councillor for the Grafton ward in 1894. On the left is the announcement of her candidacy, and on the right is the outcome of the vote. Unfortunately, she was very unsuccessful, receiving only 10 votes. It is thought that this is because she was a hotel proprietor running in a pro-temperance ward. Ellen died in 1910 and was described as being a lady of kindly and charitable disposition, responsible for many good works. The Endine set up number 25 Symonds Street as a consulting rooms. This may have been wishful thinking on the part of John and Ellen. One of their sons, Frederick Charles, was a doctor. He trained at Guy's Hospital in London and served as a surgeon in the Royal Navy during the First World War. He later became a Harley Street specialist. However, he trained and practiced in the United Kingdom, and there is no evidence that he ever registered as a doctor in New Zealand. Instead, several other doctors are known to have used this place. Frederick Robert John King lived with his family and worked from number 25. Charles Swanston, another ex-military doctor, had his consulting rooms at number 27 from 1919 until his death in 1931. And this is an advertisement announcing that he had shifted to his new consulting rooms. The wonderfully named Dr. George Thomas Humphrey de Clive Lowe occupied the consulting rooms at number 25 from 1902 to 1904. De Clive Lowe had registered as a doctor in 1897, the same year that the terraces were built, and became an ophthalmologic surgeon at Auckland Hospital. He wrote operettas, and he was an early car owner, becoming one of the founders of the Auckland Automobile Association. He told the story of when he was dragged bodily out of his car by a washing line when he was trying to park his Oldsmobile at 25 Symonds Street. The car kept going, crashing into the scullery. He remembered, when I got there, the housemaid was huddled up in a corner and the cook was standing on the kitchen table yelling. And this may well be the car that crashed into the Endine building scullery. So I hope that you've enjoyed exploring some of the medical heritage of Symonds Street with me today. These are just 4 of the medical stories of Symonds Street, and I know there are many more. All 4 of the houses are a bit unusual, bit different to the usual. The first 3 have features that you would not normally see in a traditional house. While appearing to be domestic residences, albeit quite grand ones, their interior layout reveals their dual purpose. They had additional entrances, hallways, and lobbies to direct different kinds of visitors to the appropriate parts of the house. Closed doors and dog-leg corridors would hopefully have put off all but the most intrepid of nosy patients. These places allow us to imagine how doctors and their families may have used their houses and how they kept their domestic and business spheres separate. Our 4th example was an unusual building form for Auckland, which allowed for multiple tenants and functions, and has a long history of housing medical practitioners, as well as a connection to an important Auckland woman, Ellen Endine. I'd especially like to thank Jim Kirker for sharing so many stories of his family home with me. And if you would like to see more heritage stories like this, you can join us on our Facebook and Instagram. Thank you.